Okay. Thank you, Drew and Brent. I'm going to go ahead, Drew, and let you introduce yourselves for today's seminar. Is that okay? Since you would do a more eloquent introduction of Brent than I would for sure, but since you've known him for so long. But thank you for agreeing to speak. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to you. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Greg, and thanks all of you for being here. You honor us by spending time with us on a particularly Lou. It's like what, after 5 in Atlanta. This is exactly how you wanted to start your weekend. Thank you. But it's good to be with you all. It's my distinct honor and privilege to introduce my colleague, Dr. Brent Michael Drake. Brent is of the Peoria Drakes, but now is Peoria, Illinois Drakes, but is now the Vice Provost for Decision Support at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Prior to that, he had worked at where you've been, what, for about 4 years now, right, Brent?
Well, 4.5 years, yeah.
Yep, a little over 4 years. Prior to that, he had been at Purdue University in various analysis and IR, and I'd even say to some degree IT roles. His last role at Purdue was as Chief Data Officer at Purdue University, where he was involved in a lot of the innovative analysis work they did, the Purdue Gallup survey, analytics work, predictive and prescriptive analytics work, the forecasting model, some of the other elements that Purdue did. Brent was heavily involved and or flat out led it. So I am Drew Koch. I am Chief Executive Officer of the Gardner Institute, although David and Lou and Greg know me, and so does Hayden. So I won't belabor, my bio or backdrop or lack of accomplishments. What I'll say now is that Brent and I are with you to go through some work that we've been doing over the years. One of the many privileges we have, and by the way, Brent is a fellow with the Gardner Institute, right? So he's joining us as many things, but as that as well. And one of the many things we've been able to do, privileged to be able to do, is as we're doing student record level evidence-based work with colleges and universities at the Gardner Institute. And on some level, that's what the Gardner Institute does, right? It gathers evidence from colleges and universities and helps those institutions examine and expose unjust outcome and unjust design, and then begin to use that evidence to mitigate that, right? So that's, broadly, for those of you who don't know us, we're a 22-year-old not-for-profit, and our mission statement is to help college and university educators and institutions improve teaching, learning, and student success. And in the process of doing that, so advance broader goals, societal goals associated with equity and social justice. So what Brent and I are going to delve into now is some of the data we've been able to collect from institutions, student record level data we've been able to collect from institutions sometime over the past 10 years that we've been digging into to really expose unjust design in at least 2 systems right now. One is gateway courses, and the other is transfer. And there's an overlap between those two, as you'll see what we go through. It is pretty much a descriptive analytics.
It's not pretty much so. It is entirely.
It is entirely descriptive analytics.
Research at this time.
But we don't want to limit this. What we're hoping to do is show you what we found, and then get, in addition to any questions you may have, your suggestions on further forms of research that may be descriptive, but over time could also overlap with and delve into some of the areas where you find folks are doing work. So before we get started, I thought it might be helpful for you all to introduce yourselves. I know many of you have had a great opportunity to interact with most, if not all of you before, but I could use a refresher. Brent definitely hasn't met all of you before, right?
Okay.
So we want to mitigate that gap. So if we could start with the people who are hanging out with Hussein.
Yeah.
And Hussein, right? Yeah.
Hi. So my name is Hussein. I'm a graduate student at University of Arizona. I work with Greg since last spring.
And the University of New Mexico. He's a master.
Yeah, I used to be with them in University of New Mexico as well. Yeah.
I'm Dia. I'm also a master's student here at the University of Arizona. I just started working with Greg this fall semester.
I'm Yiming Zhang. I'm a PhD student of Dr. Heilemann.
And they're actually all in ECE department here, so. And then I'm Greg Heilemann. Nice to see you, Brent, again. I'm gonna kick it over to David.
Hi, Brent. Nice to meet you. David Smith. I'm at New Mexico State University, Associate Provost for Curriculum and Assessment. I do a lot of work here on curricular analytics and have come to a few of these sessions that Greg hosts. So looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Pleasure to meet you.
Kick it to Lou. How about that?
Hi, Brent. I'm Lou Lefton. I'm a faculty in the math department at Georgia Tech. I'm also the Associate Vice President of Research Computing and work for Shawi Abdullah. And so that's one New Mexico connection. And I'm also an Albuquerque native. So that's another New Mexico.
There you go. Pleasure to meet you, Lou.
Nice to meet you too, Brent.
And
Looking
hey.
forward to it.
Hi, my name is Hayden Three. I'm a recent graduate from the University of Kentucky in computer science. I graduated in May, and that's where I met Dr. Heilemann and started working as his research assistant during my freshman year, and have been working since then. So for the last 4 years now on the curricular analytics project as a developer and researcher. And then we'll be getting my master's degree in computer science at Georgia Tech next August.
Very nice.
Unless, of course, they find out about his felony of stealing his roommate's keys. But we won't tell anybody from there about that.
I think we're gonna try the rental car. There's one app that lets you do it if you're under 25. We're gonna try that.
Oh, that's the problem. Yeah, I forgot about that.
Yeah, there's an app that lets you do it if you're under 25 though. So I think we're gonna do it.
I see Rhea and Yiming as well. I want to make sure they may or may not be here, right? But if they are, I don't want to neglect them.
No, I mean.
Yeah.
Oh,
we are
Donna, right
already-
there. Good God, you introduced yourselves. Hi, I see you, and I see you logged in as well. Nicely done. All right. Well, clearly I need a nap. Don't worry, Brent. I won't take it while you do your presentation, right? So
I'll be new. So
yeah, exactly, something different. So what we're gonna do is Brent's gonna share a presentation that we did based on a chapter we co-authored along with Elaine Seymour, formerly of CU Colorado. And Elaine is known for many, many things, but she was one of the lead authors on Talking About Leaving, Why Students Leave the STEM Fields in the late 90s. And then she wrote the follow-up to that 20 years later, Talking About Leaving Revisited. And she had been doing some work with us at the Gardner Institute, invited Brent and I to contribute to a chapter on what was called weed out courses, right? That was the verbiage from the book in the 90s, which is why we stuck with it for the book in, I guess, 2020. Tim Weston from Wisconsin was the other author on that chapter. So Brent's going to go into that, and particularly a session we did that AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences, sponsored. Brent will share more on that in a bit. Then I'm going to pick up on that using the same data set, and I'm going to go into results that we wrote up, Brent and I wrote up for a chapter in the transfer experience book that just came out. And we're looking at gateway course outcomes at transfer receiving institutions. And I'll go into some of our motivation behind that when I do it, right? If at any time the spirit moves you, you want to ask about the data, you want to ask a question, you want to tell us a logical opportunity we missed by doing it the way we did, just pipe in, right? Although we will discuss more at the end for sure. And then last but not least, at the end, we really do want to talk about, okay, based on what you saw, what recommendations do you have for us as we consider future work around this? So does that sound good, fine, fair? Something you might want to do for the next 35 to 40 minutes?
Absolutely.
okay.
Well then, Brent, don't ruin that. Yeah.
I'll start by apologizing for the fact that I'm now sitting in a dark cave. I am the only person in my office, and the motion detector lives in the hallway. So occasionally I wind up in the dark. Drew has
Oh, what
known
a
it's
good
been
design.
metaphorically for years, but you know. So let me share my screen from the slide deck, and hopefully this will pick up the way it should. Okay, so has everybody seen the slide deck now? Perfect. Okay, so as Drew mentioned, this was from the chapter that we wrote with Elaine and Tim, and then presented for the AAAS series. Wow, and now it's not advancing the way it's supposed to. There we go. So the things we talked about in that presentation, as Drew said, we kept the weed out distinction because that's what it was in the book 20 years ago. But we talked about how we define that in each of our respective studies. What were the patterns of grades, specifically DFWI rates in those courses? What were the consequences with that in terms of the persistence of the students? And then which groups of students were more at risk for not passing the courses in each of those courses. So for us, when we do this with our member institutions, we actually define it as gateway courses with them rather than saying weed out. And the data set we're working from for this was across 36 different institutions. Their individual student by course unit record between 2012 and 2014, so before we started doing any intervention work with them, in 7 different subject areas. And so the 7 subject areas were intro chemistry, intro biology, algebra, calculus, accounting. I gotta actually look at my notes to make sure here. History, intro psychology, and intro rhetoric and composition. And it was courses that within the curriculum were meant to be taken in the first or second year of the curriculum, and that the institution defined as having a large number of students within the course. We let the institution define what it felt was large number of students, since we were working across institutions of various sizes. So it was large in terms of relative terms for their campus. Of the 36 institutions, they were across the entire educational spectrum. So we went from all the way from associate colleges up to research universities at all 3 levels of research activity. The total base for database for those 3 years consisted over a little over 1.2 million student records. What we talked about here is the aggregate across all of those 36 institutions, and we use the institution as the level of analysis. Since we have different institutional sizes, we did it by what was the rate for an institution in a subject area, so that we didn't have one large institution dominating all of the results in the data. So starting with what does it look like just in terms of the pass-fail rates for these courses? So across those 36 institutions, the average DFWI rate for our STEM courses, and that's what we were focusing on here, so the biology, chemistry, algebra, and calculus, was in the 30 to 34% range. So about a third of the students in all of these courses were not passing. And to be clear with this, since we're talking about STEM disciplines, a C is not really passing in most of those in your prerequisite courses to move on. So we're actually talking about a little bit bigger issue there with it. And from the work you all have done around curricular analytics, you know that these courses oftentimes in the STEM disciplines serve as blocker courses for getting into the higher level coursework. So when we're talking about 1/3 of the students do not pass the courses in all of those entry blocker courses, it is not surprising the challenge we have in terms of graduation rate in the STEM disciplines. If we're failing 30% of the students in their first 2 gateway courses, then how the heck can we ever expect to have better than a 60% grad rate at best within those disciplines? So we then start looking. Oh,
Hey,
go ahead.
Brent, quick question, yeah.
Yeah, just a quick one. So you say DFW, W mean withdrawn?
Withdrawn.
Yeah, withdrawn from the course. So withdrawn late enough in the cycle that they had to have a grade within it, a W grade.
Okay.
If they dropped out in the first 2 weeks in their add drop period, then they wouldn't wind up in our data set.
And hey, Brent, real quick question. These are, this is the DEF-WI rates for all students or just those in STEM majors?
This is for all students.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. So then we split that out by various demographic variables to really talk about what's happening in terms of the social justice issues with it. So beginning with gender, this is no surprise, as in all things higher ed and really all things life, women are doing better than men in all of these subject areas. That's not overly surprising, lines up with a lot of what you see in the higher education literature. So then when we start looking at it by race, and specifically looking at races that have historically been underrepresented in higher education and certainly underrepresented in STEM disciplines, what we see is that in all cases, African-American Black students, Native American Indian or Native American students, and Latinx students always have higher DFWI rates. And honestly, while we're doing this as the average across the institutions, it is almost always that they are always higher at every single institution. And you can see in many cases, we start getting into the above 50% range for those non-passing rates, those DFWI rates for the students. So we're losing half of the students within their first term within those domestic minorities. And then when we look at it by other socioeconomic factors, whether a student was first generation, and in this case, we allowed the institutions to define first generation because some do it by neither parent has ever completed a 4-year degree, and some do it by neither parent has ever enrolled in higher education at all. We let them define it at their level. So when we look at the first generation status and whether a student was a Pell recipient, or excuse me, not recipient, we use Pell eligible on this table, was a Pell eligible student, what we see is that the first generation and the Pell eligible students always have higher DFWI rates as well. Pell sometimes at an individual institution isn't a distinguishing factor. And you can even see amongst the averages, particularly, we even see it amongst the averages in the, nope, I'm thinking about the transfer study. So I'm getting ahead of myself, never mind. Drew will talk about in the transfer study that Pell isn't always a distinguishing characteristic. However, in these, it was that Pell was always higher across all of the subject areas. So when I talk about you're losing students, one of every 2 students in the first term, the reason we talk about that is the DFWI rate in these gateway courses is, of course, highly related to whether the student persists at the institution or not. And so what we provided here was the DFWI rate differences between the status of a student in terms of their persistence. And again, talked about the fact that these are courses that are meant to be in the first 2 years of a discipline. However, as I'm sure everyone is aware, oftentimes if they can, students will delay taking some of these courses, or they might be a transfer student that was required to retake one of these courses very late in their cycle when they transfer to an institution. So we have students, the gray bar, who actually graduate after taking one of these gateway / introductory courses, that the next year they've graduated from the institution. And so what you see is that those students who wind up graduating a year later always have the lowest DFWI rates, followed by those students who persist. And then those students who voluntarily withdraw from the institution have the highest DFWI rates, all around the 50% range. And the reason why I emphasize voluntarily withdraw here is these are students who are in good academic standing. They were eligible to re-register at their institutions. When we look at the students who maybe failed multiple courses and thus were academically dismissed from their institution, the DFWI rates among those students is always in the 90% range. So of those getting academically dismissed, they're always failing these 4 courses. So, and that is the highlight.
Brent, I just want to make sure I understand what you just said. The orange one were academically eligible but not retained, and the blue were.
Nope.
Can you go back?
Let me go back to it real quick. Of course, it's going to make me lead my way through all the way through again. Sorry about that. So the oranges, yes, those who voluntarily left the institution, they were academically eligible to re-enroll and chose not to. The blue is those who did stay at the institution. They were retained into their next year. The gray is graduated. What is not on this chart is those who are academically dismissed from their institution. And those who are academically dismissed, the DFWI rate among them is always 90% or higher.
Got it. And how many years of data is this for these schools? Is it 1 year or do you have multiple?
It's 3 years of data for this. So it's 2012 through 2014 in these subjects.
Okay, thank you. Okay, very good.
And so now I'll pass over to Drew to talk about the transfer work.
Thanks, Brent. So I'm pulling right now from a deck we're using for an upcoming presentation for middle states. And for a little bit of context, transfer is one of the 6 systems we took a look at in our series on socially just design and post-secondary education. And Greg and Brent and David will very much so remember that, simply because, and Lou may, because Shawi and Greg and David and Brent either did case studies or were the plenary speakers in one of those system chapters. I think all of you were in the curriculum one, right? So, but now I want to reference that series because this fits into that, and we shared this as part of that work, although in the transfer chapter. So will say that our considerations on this is that on transfer, we were or do consider transfer largely as an unjust system. And we name it or call it such because often it's been unexamined and concepts around it have been unquestioned, right? And that lack of examination and inability to question what goes on in transfer as a result of not being willing to question it really perpetuates unjust design. So our sort of working mantra on this, not just working, it actually is working, not just sort of preliminary, is that in order to change the unjust outcomes on all of this, we have to examine what's going on in this transfer system, and that faculty and courses are often overlooked in the process of doing so. Our criticism in our book, and it's meant constructively, is that transfer is viewed often as an admissions enrollment management function. And it doesn't take into account the entirety of the experience, particularly the experience in courses and the broader curriculum of which transfer is a part. Now, we've been blessed to be working with Greg a lot on also understanding how credits earned actually fulfill degree requirements, which is the broader curricular piece, which is very different than just fulfilling articulation agreements or transferring in, right? And then winding up as distributed or elective credit. So that's a related form of work. This work particularly looked at what Brent and I called momentum stoppers and equity blockers. And we really wanted to take a look at what happened to transfer students once they got to the transfer receiving institution and took gateway courses. And when we first proposed this, I remember a really widely recognized and highly regarded higher ed scholar saying, I didn't even know transfer students took gateway courses. Well, the answer is they absolutely positively do. And the outcomes are complex. And to reinforce that, we'll show you what Brent and I discovered. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. With a nod to Arlo Guthrie Jr., we are using circles and arrows, right? And those of you that don't know, Alice's Restaurant, I just gave you one of the great lines of it, but we'll do that here. And, you know, to highlight what's on tables, because otherwise we're violating every rule of PowerPoint. But here, these are the 8 courses Brent mentioned in the, and by the way, it's the same data set, right? So to be clear, but this is a different slice or a different type of analysis. And 7 areas, but 8 courses. And Brent already went into what those are, but you can see them by name there. We reached out initially to a little over 50 institutions that we were working with, and then asked them to confirm, you know, what was their actual principles of accounting course, you know, what was their introduction to U.S. history course. A lot of times when you looked at course designations and or titles, you couldn't really tell, right? They had very similar, but so we said to them, you tell us which one to look at. And that allowed us to basically do an apples to apples comparison across the institutions. 36 institutions got back, but not all institutions had a introduction to U.S. history or a principles of accounting course, right? And that's why you'll see anything from 31 in general chemistry to upwards of 34 in college algebra and rhetoric and composition, English writing, and in psychology, right? So they're largely universally offered, but not always offered in all institutions, right? So, and then our enrollments really range from about a little over 13,000 in calculus to upwards of 100,000, just over 95,000 in English composition, right? So it kind of gives you a sense on the scale. Now, what we took a look at as part of this analysis were the DFW rates. Again, the combined rate of D grades, F grades, any type of withdrawal that was on the transcript, and otherwise it didn't yield positive credits, right, one way or the other. And I's for incompletes. And we're frequently asked, why'd you include the I? And it's largely because they tend to linger and then turn into Fs if not completed in time. So it again, and even if they do change into something other than, if it's a C, B, A, it is not earned credit in the term. So that's why we include that in the rate. We looked at it for 3 populations. In column E, you'll see non-transfer first year, right? A lot of times folks will say, well, these are native students. I bristle when I hear that for a whole host of reasons. It somehow means that a student that came to you, maybe their second term in college is somehow less indigenous in the institution than somebody who started a term before. So we just went with transfer, non-transfer. And that actually mirrors the way that the integrated post-secondary education data system is doing its sort of outcome metrics reporting as well. So we had non-transfer in column E, where they had 30 or fewer credits. That's how we called them first year, non-transfer first year, right? We had transfers, and that was a student who was not classified as a non-transfer first year. And then we also had, and that was column F. And then we also had non-transfers upper level, and those were non-transfers, sophomores, juniors, seniors, with 30 or more credits, right? So we wanted to take a look at those 3 distinct populations to see if we saw any difference in DFWI rates. I'm going to take you quickly through one example in general psych, and then I'll also go into the sort of broader outcome. Oops, question?
Yeah, Drew, it just occurred to me, I've seen this before, but it just occurred to me and maybe it was too difficult, but can you control for the background preparation in those 2? I mean, might that account for some of the variance?
It could. We may be able to, but not
Okay.
consistently, right? So
Okay.
we asked
You need
for
to know.
Go ahead, Greg.
You would need to know, like, rather than just the pass rates in the class, you need to know that's a lot more data. I get it. Okay.
Yeah,
while we get some of the academic profile information for the students that are first year students at the institution, oftentimes institutions don't record all that information for transfer students.
Yep, same here. Yep, you're right. Okay, so it's kind of hard to do that.
Yeah, so some, but it's messy, right? And not to say that all of this was as neat and tidy as the table implies, but it was, could be. So quickly flying through general psychology as an example, 34 institutions offered it with a little over 91,000 students. The average DFWI rate was 25.3. Often people will say things like, well, that's pretty good. That means 3/4 of the students progressed. What you'll notice is that Brent shared it already, there's a direct correlation between not doing well in even one gateway course and not being around later. And then there are obviously race, ethnicity, and family income implications in all of this. And then for the non-transfer first-year students, those students had a 28.4% DFWI rate. In psych, they had the highest. In the transfer students had a 22.3. They had the second lowest, and then the lowest was for non-transfer students. So I jumped a little bit there. There's a bit of a lag, forgive me. What I want to do is just give you a high-level overview of findings. What you see in these blue circles are the lowest DFWI rates, right? Anytime a population had the lowest DFWI rate. So in the non-transfer first years, often called first-time full-time, or but not only first-time full-time based on our definition, but you'll note that those students had the lowest DFWI rate in calculus. It still doesn't sing awesome because it's just shy of 35%, but it is the instance where non-transfer first-year students had the lowest DFWI rate. In column F, you see the instances where transfer students had the lowest DFWI rate, and that was in principles of accounting and in general chemistry. And we don't have and didn't have transcript data from their sending institutions. So this is conjecture, and at least my part. Brent may want to own it, he may want to deny it, right? He's welcome. But it's maybe our thinking that the reason why these students, the transfer students, had the lowest DFWI rates in those courses. I mean, the argument can be made they're just smarter and did better, but we think, while that could be true, we also think it's not the first time they took the courses. We think there may be a bit, if not a lot, of the transfer receiving institutions said, great, you took accounting there, but it's not our accounting, you're going to take it again. And this,
Yes.
we've seen the same happen in chemistry because of the lab science. And we even saw this where Brent and I worked both at the same institution for a while. That College of Science and other colleges did not necessarily always count chemistry taking at the community college in the same town because there were questions about the credibility of their lab and their lab facilities. So there were many instances, and it even depended sometimes who your advisor was, whether general chemistry applied. So that could be some of what's going on there.
Yeah, I think I have a comment about this. So I think you are right, because you can see a big difference between column E and G. However, but for students like transfer, like column F and G, I don't see a huge difference. And maybe these differences are only because, for other factors than just transfer and non-transfer students.
Yeah. Now, though, there are a couple things going on with non-transfer upper level students, but Brent, if you don't mind addressing the difference elements, because we have the various p-values on there. And they may look small, but I'm going to let Brent explain some of it. Go ahead.
Yeah, but this is why we get into some of our hypotheses that with the transfer students, we are sometimes seeing them retake their courses. So the non-transfer upper level students overwhelmingly are a repeat in the course. Not always. Sometimes they just held off for forever, but often are a student that is repeating the course, which is similar to our hypothesis on what is going on with the transfer students and why we often see them as having lower DFWI rates as well, is because we believe oftentimes they're repeating the course, and in their case, maybe repeating it after having already passed it. The one where it is, we don't see that pattern where it's the transfer or the upper level students with the lowest DFWI rate is in calculus. And again, this is just a hypothesis. We haven't tested it in any way, but our belief with that is that it's because the first year students are closer to the last calculus course they took as a student. They probably took a pre-calc or a calc in high school, or maybe in their first semester at the institution, and now they're taking their calculus. And the transfer student and the non-transfer upper level may be a couple years removed from that course. Again, that's entirely supposition. We haven't tested it yet, but we think that might be what is happening in the pattern we see there.
I'm going to jump quickly, and these are, by the way, where the instances are of the highest DFWI rates. So you will note in 5 instances, non-transfer first years have the highest DFWI rates. Never in math, right? And that pops out. And transfers have the highest DFWI rates, always in math, right? And so that's what's leading us to assert the following when we did in the chapter. Obviously, transfer standing matters in complex ways, right? Particularly when you look at accounting and chemistry, where we do think they're taking it again or being required to take it again, and also in math and English. And English is brackets because it's not massively different. The math, we think at least potentially has to do, at least in part, with time between when they last had their math and took it again, right? So it, or next took a math, right? And then some of the implications here are frequently you will see things done for incoming first-year students with mathematics, and but for some reason it's not done with transfers. Often there's the statement that's transfers have done college before. What we're arguing is what's good for first-year students is good for transfers. What's good for transfers and all students, including upper level students, is just good pedagogy is good pedagogy. So we are encouraging institutions to think about, if you're doing things like a math bridge or co-requisite remediation or things along those lines, don't just look at your traditional first-year students, look at whoever, don't leave out transfer students as you're thinking about that. Now, we also wanted to take a look at factors associated with family income and race ethnicity. And there we did it as a comparison within transfer students, right? So we compared transfer students. In this case, we used Pell as a proxy for income, with Pell being the Pell Grant, which it's not necessarily a perfect proxy, but it is good as a one as we had, given that there are federal formulas for who does or doesn't receive a Pell Grant based on family income. Now, you could be a couple dollars off and not receive either full or partial, but it does at least serve as a decent, consistent proxy across institutions. So we use that to examine income. We compared Pell eligible transfer students to non-Pell eligible transfer students, so that we're holding the variable of transfer consistent, and then Pell, again, as a variable, at least as determined externally by the federal formula, is also consistent. Either you got or you didn't, right? So that was our examination, or the lens we used for income. And then what we found, there was one and only one instance where Pell students had the lowest DFWI rate, right? And that was in Gen Chem. And I don't know why, right? I mean, it just, yes, and then in every other instance, non-Pell students had the lowest DFWI rate. So on one level, we're not surprised given the, the implications associated with higher level of family resource and potential wealth here. But if the argument is being made that transfer, starting at a community college in particular, is all about social mobility, then clearly what's going on at the four-year institution and gateway courses isn't necessarily helping on that, particularly when you look at elements associated with income. We did a different but similar analysis. We took a look at race and ethnicity as the variable, and here we use the federal race ethnicity designations. We didn't put everything in this. We did, however, look at, basically BIPOC students, African American, Native American, Indigenous, Latinx, and then white students, and did a comparison. We have more and more populations that we looked at, but for purposes here, we did those comparisons, right? So just as a reminder, we're comparing this both to the average, and also we're comparing it, as you'll see, to the DFWI rate for white students, which is in column F. The blue, again, being consistent, are the lowest DFWI rates. There is one instance where African Americans had the lowest DFWI rate. That's in English composition. All other 7 instances, white students had the lowest DFWI rate, right? So, race and elements associated with race, and historically speaking, and also in a contemporary context, still play out with white students succeeding better. And it may have to do with, we believe it has to do with structural inequity that's inherent in the system right now. What I also wanted to show you were the instances where there were the lowest DFWI rates. And those instances occurred for transfer students in 4 courses. They were African Americans, and in 4 courses, Native Americans, although in many instances, Latinx numbers approximated or were the second highest DFWI rate amongst comparables, right? So our takeaway on all of this is that Again, transfer matters in complex ways. Race, ethnicity matter. Pell status matters. And a lot of times folks never looked at this and maintain the sort of myth that transfer is, particularly transfer from a community college to a four-year institution is about social mobility, about affording students educational opportunity. But based on what we're seeing is a lot of times, or not a lot, on average, the color of your skin and the size of your parents or your family's wallets really are the best determinants, whether you're a transfer student or not, but definitely if you're a transfer student, if you're going to succeed in gateway courses. And then based on what Brent shared in our previous analysis, if you're even going to be around at the institution or finish a degree later. Now, often we heard things like, well, Drew or Brent, that maybe the students just find another major. Based on what we've looked at, and also based on the research that Cliff Edelman did with two massive data sets from the Department of Education, and he wrote about it in the Answers in the Toolbox, and then Answers in the Toolbox Revisited. When the students, even in one foundational level course or gateway course, earn a DFWI rate, they're not only statistically unlikely to finish the degree at the institution where they earned the grade. Over an 8-year period of time, they're statistically unlikely to finish anywhere else. So this myth that, oh, they'll just find another major or they'll transfer to another institution and do well there, it's not supported by the evidence that we have and that other people have used. So I'll stop there because that was 35 minutes of tables and circles and arrows, and Drew and Brent do want to open it up to some discussion, some either questions or some suggestions for further forms of research. So Brent, I turn it to you fine folks.
And I am just gonna.
Casey, hi. It's good to see you.
I am just gonna point out one other thing related to the question Greg asked around the transfers, talking about the preparation of the students in the first year work. So yes, historically in first gen Pell recipient and minority groups, you'll see lower academic preparation as well. They're coming from lower prepared high schools. They tend to have lower test scores, things of that nature. And we acknowledge that, and that does matter in terms of their outcomes within college. However, it is depressing as someone who's devoted their life to higher education to say, or just perpetuating that problem we're having in our K through 12 educational system, and just passing along to say, well, come from those lower socioeconomic backgrounds, don't worry, you don't need a college degree. Someone's got to take out our trash.
Yeah, we also look at it this way and say, okay, yes, we can see that in a data set, but the institution admitted them and put them in the courses, right? So, or somebody put them in the courses, right? Even if the students put themselves in there, there are instances where we will hear in, anecdotally speaking, well, the students signed themselves in or got a faculty member put in who didn't know any better. There was no structural check in place to examine that. So to me, it's okay. Can we at least acknowledge that if you're going to say, well, it's an issue of prior preparation, that the institution put the student or has the student in those courses, and then there's a moral obligation to just not perpetuate inequity by saying, well, we put them in, we gave them a fair shot, right? So.
Do they, Drew, I'm wondering, and Brent, of these 30 some institutions, maybe they don't even know, like, as an instructor, I don't know if someone in my class is a transfer student or not. So probably they're just not aware it's happening, more likely, right?
Correct. And they're not going to know if students a Pell recipient, if students first generation. They're not going to know any of that.
Well, that's why we emphasize that piece along the lines of like good pedagogy being good pedagogy, right? And I mean from the standpoint, it's not. I mean, if you knew you had 5 transfer students in your course, would you teach them any differently? Probably not, right? But if you knew certain forms of pedagogical approaches or certain forms of co-requisite remediation. I mean, this is what, and Greg, you know this as well as anybody, right? What Nathan Klingbeil did. It was like, what do the students need to learn, all students, to be successful? And then lo and behold, it worked well for all students, but it particularly worked well from students from previously disadvantaged and underpowered backgrounds, right? The students have the capability to succeed. It was about putting the right structures and using the right approaches. So that's what we're encouraging through this work. It was a lot of data. I'm sorry, nobody passed away in this session, thank goodness. So it wasn't quite death by data, but we were coming close, right? So
and Greg, I'll go even scarier for, so you say, I don't know if students to transfer my course or whatever. Frighteningly, as we have talked about this across some of the institutions, there are a number of faculty who have no idea what their grade distribution is in their courses anyway.
Right.
Or
right.
Particularly when we talked to the Historical Society about the history rates, they were like, oh my God, 27% of kids don't pass US history. Yeah.
And then, you know, the American Historical Association has taken a very active stance on, particularly given the prominence of history of late in political discussions and how students are taught and what they're taught. And there was there was like holy blank. We got to get our house in order, because here we are turning around saying this stuff, and we didn't realize African Americans have almost 100% greater likelihood of not doing well in US history. And that's directly correlated with not being back at the institution, right? So it just this evidence has motivated, in that one instance, a discipline association to say, good God, we got to do better. Casey, you were going to ask something. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was wondering if you know about the kind of time dependency of these events. Like you mentioned that even one DFWI means basically that student is out of the system. Does that happen, you know, in their second or third semester once they've transferred, or are most of those happening the first semester they're here, such that interventions could be put in place for that transfer semester? Like if you get them through one semester, is that enough? And then even if they do fail later, they can recover?
So Brent, go ahead. You were going to answer this.
I was just going to say, while we haven't specifically looked to that level in this data, we know from what we see in terms of progression of students overall within the cohorts and the structure of these courses that, one, yes, these are courses that overwhelmingly happen in the first or second semester, although that is not always the case, as we talked about within some of the results. And we also know, we also know this from the higher ed literature for the last several decades, that yes, while there can still be blockage points later on that ultimately lead to the student leaving the institution, if they get through the first year, their odds of completing go up astronomically.
So, and Casey, for purposes of this research, we looked at the data set for a given academic year.
Okay.
And we then said, at the subsequent fall census, were you back?
Mm-hmm.
So that was our sort of time constraint in this. There are many other ways to define that. You can go term to term. You can go over multiple terms. We just looked in the previous academic year. Did you take the course? Were you one of these three populations? And were you back the subsequent fall at census, right? So that's how we defined retained for purposes of this analysis. So to your point, we didn't do much more on the sort of time studies or things along those lines. And it could be one way to go deeper. One concern I have is even with over, I don't know, but it looks like well over 100,000 students in this data set, we'd probably start running into much smaller ends as we split it out over time, right? That's not a reason not to do it. I just wanted you to know how we did do it taking into account academic years and periods.
Yeah, I mostly ask because my lens is the intervention piece. Like, how do we get people through that first year? And so I was curious if the data supported anything there. And
Yeah, to me, the suggestion is you have them as a captive audience when they are in that course.
mhm.
So the best period to intervene is when you have them, right? And then the interventions need to be, I referenced Nathan Klingbeil's work, but do them in a manner where it's embedded. We particularly see for, Kay McClenny in her research around community colleges, she coined the phrase at-risk students don't do optional. So that's where the embedded components, whether it's embedded peer support, embedded components, and also the sequencing of not just courses, but content. What I liked about Nathan's work, and I keep referencing it, I'll stop if those of you aren't familiar with it, but after this, I'll stop, is that, he looked at what do you need to know in this course in order to succeed in circuits, right? What differential equation? And so that was emphasized in the sort of process of doing some co-requisite remediation so that the student was ready in the next term to enroll into circuits. So it's both within the term and also taking account what comes next. That's based on what we've been doing, what I've been doing for almost 30 years now, what Brent's been doing almost that long. That's what I'd recommend based on, what the evidence tells us and what we've seen elsewhere.
Yeah, that involves changing faculty culture though, and good luck with that.
Now,
I'll just say that
Yeah.
lines up with what Greg found at UNM in terms of some of the engineering students, in terms of the curricular sequencing with it, and what they were able to change in the intro course. That was a real blocking point, pushing that forward into being an introductory section in the second course, dramatically improved their pass rates and their graduation rates within the engineering discipline.
Yeah.
I think Lou has his hand up, but before, I think we need to have Casey introduce herself.
Okay, I'll do that very quickly because I actually just realized I'm late to my next meeting that I'm hosting.
Okay.
My name is Casey Kilbaugh. I'm the director of the Health Sciences Design Program here at the University of Arizona with Greg. But my reason for being here with you all is that I'm a co-PI on an STEM grant that's looking at bridging community college and university culture to HSIs. And we have a very robust system in place where we're mentoring small cohorts of students with scholarships and faculty mentoring, faculty from both universities, peer mentors, lots of, courses. Like it's a very high touch program and very expensive programmatically, but we're seeing really good results. But I'm very interested in the curricular analytics work that Greg and his group do. So I asked him to start inviting me to things. So that's why I'm here.
Casey,
Thank you, Casey, for showing up. We appreciate it.
Yeah, Casey, thanks for showing up. We know you got to go. Brent and I are involved in a Sloan Foundation funded grant, along with the Seismic Group out of Michigan and also Elaine Seymour's group from the Talk About Leaving Revisited. And I mention this because some of it is around faculty culture. So if there's an opportunity to reconnect, Greg can give you our email addresses, like we won't bombard you. So if you want to connect.
I would love that. The more conversations and resources and people doing this work, the better.
Yeah.
So thank you all. I'm going to run.
Thank you, Casey.
Bye, Casey.
Bye.
Yeah.
Lou, you had a question, I think.
Yeah, I mean, just kind of following up on the notion of what Drew said, and I heard the further discussion that while they're in the classroom, the pedagogy is what is going to have an impact, as opposed to sort of structuring support programs for first generation students that are but in fact it's, and probably because of the faculty culture hill that you have to climb, it probably most universities are trying to do the support program piece, right? That seems easier than, okay, so we're going to have a special tutoring sessions, or we're going to identify transfer students, and I'm wondering if sort of why not both? Do you know of any, or anybody here know of universities that are just simply kind of, I guess, tracking, for lack of a better word, putting all the transfer students in with the best teacher or
No,
someone
that's
who's, just
Wow.
actually sort of taking the pedagogy and the external kind of programmatic support, because I always say we need to, it's not about recruiting students of color, it's also about supporting them on their journey through, and so one of the ways that you can support them is maybe not in a bolt-on thing, but actually in the curriculum.
Yeah, Lou, I don't know of any institution that said, these are best teachers, so let's stick transfer students in with them. And I wrestle with that simply because that means somebody else has to get stuck with the not best teachers.
Sure. I mean,
So-
ideally, the pedagogy would just rule the day.
Yeah. So to me, and
Have you,
some
Mike?
of some of this comes back to how do we prepare, and to Casey's point, she said, good luck with fixing or changing faculty culture. In many instances, in the absence of evidence, we'll just believe whatever the hell we already believe, right? And I have to say, in defense of our faculty colleagues, is that frequently we don't give them any evidence like this to think about, right? So to me,
Yeah, Drew, I think that's the issue. People don't, it's like, I think it's connected to what I asked before. Oh, sorry, David, I interrupted. But I thought that was a really perceptive question, though. I had not thought about that, but I think it's because we haven't been forced to think about it because we don't know that this class has X number of transfer, right? So really interesting. Sorry, David, I didn't mean to.
No worries. I was just going to follow up on the idea of being strategic about instructor assignments, which I think is an approach that I would like to emphasize here. In response to what you said, Drew, about then you're saying you're giving the students to a poor teacher later. Well, hopefully it is later that they're encountering those weaker teachers when the students have more skills to self-learn and to deal with those deficiencies. So I think there is an argument that obviously we want to improve the instruction of all of our teachers and not just accept the weaknesses, but I think there are some places where the students would be more well equipped to deal with the poor instruction than others. If you're actually focused in your curriculum and developing those skills for students of self-learning, then that should at least assist. I'm not trying to excuse the weaker instructors, but
yeah, on that note, David, this is anecdotal. I'll acknowledge it, right? But I will share it. We worked with Western Michigan University on redesign of 8 courses, one of which was calculus. And now in Calc, I'd love to tell you that every section did it. No, Tabitha Mingus's section did it. It's sections, right? And she's an associate professor of math and focused on introductory calculus as her. And she had wonderful decreases in WI rates in aggregate, and particularly for historically marginalized populations. The problem, though, that she saw is that particularly for students of color and students from low income backgrounds, they were succeeding and they were learning because they were using the same exams across sections, right? It wasn't that Tabitha lowered the standards, they were actually learning better. But when they progressed on to subsequent math courses, you saw the disparities emerge again. And some of it came back to, she was using those pedagogical structures, but other instructors in subsequent courses were not. So I think we ultimately really have to focus and give reason to focus on pedagogy, sequencing, and structures. Now, I will say in some instances, there may be wonderful, and I'll use math because we're talking about math researchers who are absolutely positively wonderful mathematical researchers, but they're sort of the arsenic of learning, right? And again, not meant as a jab, but if we know that, then we have to address our structures on some level and say, should they maybe be working with grad students, right? And or other upper level students, to your point, David. There are a lot of thoughts we've given, and it's not in this, around the academic labor model. and arguments around the academic labor model and arguments around academic freedom and academic labor, which are just flat out problematic when you begin to see who's teaching foundation level courses, how they're contracted. And if the argument is you have to have tenure or tenure track in order to have academic freedom, then most people teaching foundation level courses have none of that, right? So anyway, I'll stop with that. But I think at the end of the day, we do have to think about giving evidence in front of faculty, letting them understand and digest what that means, and then using that as a means to help them learn about evidence-based strategies to improve teaching, learning, and equitable outcomes.
And towards your point, Greg, about most faculty don't know what like the distribution of their students are in the classes or anything of that nature. All of the institutions I've worked at, every institution that I've done any kind of work with Gardner, direct consulting and everything, overwhelmingly what I get from faculty is, it would be great if you would do dashboards for each of our classes where we could see things like, what's the preparation of our students coming in? What's the demographic breakout? Where does it come down? So there's a lot of that is, boy, we would love to know that so we could actually think about how we could design this better to fit the students we have in the course.
I've seen a really good one at UC Riverside. It was UC Riverside. They had this, and this guy gave an amazing talk where they created this dashboard for every class where you looked in it. It showed this is the percent of first gen, this is the percent of transfer, all of these things, and here's what it was the last time you taught the class, and here's the grade distribution for students in those categories. And if you would like to learn more about how to serve first generation students, click here. Really well done. I'll send you in fact, I might try and get him to give a talk to this.
Yeah, I think that'd be great.
That would be awesome.
Yeah, that'd be great. And also, Brent
I'll reach out
bristles.
to him.
Yeah, no, that's great, Greg. Brent bristles because I always love that, and he's like, "Damn it, Drew, you want every cell size to be a single digit." But I will say, yeah, let's see if we can get that talk. That'd be great, Greg.
Hey, you go. Let's go ahead and stop the. Okay. I wanted to just give Lou a chance to mention